Chapters 11 and 12 of Notes of a Camp Follower on the Western Front by E. W. Hornung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. Notes of a Camp Follower on the Western Front by E. W. Hornung. Chapter 11. Gunners. Next to the jocks, I used to find the gunners the cheeriest souls about a hut. Nor do I believe that mine was a chance experience, for the constant privilege of inflicting damage on the Hun must be, despite a very full share of his counter-attentions, a perpetual source of satisfaction. A gunner is oftener up and doing, far seldomer merely suffering, than any other being under arms. The infantry have so much to grin and bear, so very much that would be unbearable without a grin, that it is no wonder if the heroic symbol of their agony be less in evidence upon ordinary occasions. Cheeriness with them has its own awful connotation. They are almost automatically at their best when things are at their worst, but the gunner is always enjoying the joke of making things unpleasant for the other side. He is the bowler who is nearly certain of a good match. He used to turn up at our hut at all hours, sometimes in a balaclava helmet that reminded one of other winter sports, often with his extremities frozen by long hours in the saddle or on his limber, but never wearied by much marching, never in any but the best of spirits. He was always an interesting man, who knew the line as a strolling player knows the road, but neither knew nor cared where he was to give his next performance. I associate him with a ruddy visage and a hearty manner that brought a breeze in from the outer world, as a good stage sailor brings one from the wings. One great point about the gunners is that you can see them at their job. I had seen them at it on a former brief visit to the front, and even had a foretaste of their quality of humour, which is by no means so heavy as a civilian wag might apprehend. The scene was the tight-rope road between Albert and Bapaume, then stretched across a chasm of inconceivable devastation, and only 3 parts in our hands. In fact, we were industriously shelling Bapaume and its environs when a car from the visitor's chateau dumped 2 of us, attended by a red-tabbed chaperone, in the very middle of our guns. Not even in later days do I remember such a row as they were making. Shells are as bad, but I imagine one does not hear a great many quite so loud and live to write about it. Drum fire must be worse at both ends, but I have heard only distant drum fire, and on the spot it must have this advantage, that its continuity precludes surprise. But a series of shattering surprises was the essence of our experience before Bapaume. The guns were all over the place and fiendishly camouflaged. I was prepared for all sorts of cunning and picturesque screens and emplacements, and indeed had looked for them. I was not prepared for absolute invisibility of cannons of enormous calibre that seemed to loose off over our shoulders or through our legs the moment our backs were turned. If you happened to be looking round, you were all right. You saw the flash, and your eye forewarned your ear in a fraction of a second before the bang, besides reassuring you as to the actual distance between you and the blazing gun. But whenever possible it took mean advantage, and had me ducking as though somebody had shouted "Heads!" I say me, not before it was time, for I can only speak with honesty for myself. By flattering chance I was pretending to enjoy this experience in good company indeed, but the great man might have been tramping his own moor and doing the shooting himself, for all the times I saw his eyelids flicker or his massive shoulders wince. He made no more of a howitzer that jovially thundered and lightened in our path, over our heads, than of the brace of 60-pounders whose peculiarly ear-destroying duet scratched the brain's coat of curd as we stood only too close behind them. They might have been a brace of Irish members, for all their intimidatory effect on my illustrious companion. But the fun came when we adjourned to the battery commander's dug-out, and somebody suggested that the forward observing officer would feel deeply honoured by a word on the telephone from so high an officer of state. All urbanity, the OS took down the receiver, and was heard introducing himself to the FOO by his official designation, as though high office alone could excuse such a liberty, The receiver crackled like a young machine gun, and the OS beamed dryly on the OC. "He wants to know who the devil I really am," he reported with due zest. Hastily the spectacled young major vouched for the other speaker. The receiver changed hands once more. The forward observing officer was evidently as good as his style and title. "He says, in that case, I'd better look him up," twinkled the OS. "Is there time? He says he's quite close to the sugar factory." The sugar factory was unmistakable, not as a flagrant sugar factory, but as the only fragment of a building left standing within the skyline. It proved a snare. Our FOO was unknown there. If he had ever been at the ex-factory, he had kept himself to himself and gone without leaving an address. And though we sought him high and low among the shell holes, under the belching muzzles of our guns, it was not intended by Providence, nor yet peradventure by himself, that we should track the light artillery comedian to his place of concealment. Still, one can get at a gunner, in the above sense only, quicker than at any other class of acquaintance in the line. It is, after all, a very small war in the same sense as it is said to be a small world, and in our ruined town I was always running into some soldier who I had known of old in leather or prunella. I have had the pleasure of serving an old servant as an impressive NCO, of welcoming others of all ranks on both sides of the counter. Thus it was that one day I had a car lent me to go pretty well where I liked, subject to the approval of a young staff officer, my escort. I thought of a gunner friend hidden away somewhere in those parts. He was an old boy of my old school. So, as it happened, was the high commander to whom the car belonged. So, by an extraordinary chance, was the young staff officer. Oldest of them, of course, long years after my time. But an Uppingham day for me, if ever I had one. I only wish we could have claimed the hero of the day as well. The car took us to within a couple of miles of my friend, who was not above another mile from no man's land. It was a fairly lively sector at the best of times, which was about the time I was there. The enemy had shown unseasonable activity only the night before, and we met some of the casualties coming down a light railway, up which we walked the last part of the way. 2 or 3 khaki figures pushing a truck laden with a third figure, supine, blanketed, and very still. That was the picture we passed several times in the thin February sunlight. One man looked as dead as the living landscape. One had a bloody head and a smile that stuck. One was walking, supported by a Red Cross man, coughing weakly as he went. Round about our destination were a number of shell sockets, very sharp and clean, all made in the night. It was quite the deepest dug-out I was ever in, but I was not sorry when I found my eyes in the twilight of its single candle. Warm down there, a petrol engine throbbing incomprehensibly behind a curtain at the foot of the flight, a ventilating shaft at the inner end, hardly any more room than an Uppingham study. How we talked about the old place, 3 school generations of us, sitting 2 on a bed until I broke down the Major's. The Major might have been bored before that, he who alone had not been there. But even my ponderous performance did not disturb a serene forbearance, a show of more than courteous interest, which encouraged us to persist in that interminable gossip about masters, with imitations, so maddening to the uninitiated. At length the petrol engine stopped. I doubt if we did, though steak and onions now arrived. May I never savour their crude smell again without remembering that time and place. The oftener the better, if there be those present who do not know about the Major. His second in command, my Uppingham friend, told me as he saw us along the light railway on our way back. In 1914 he had been a nonconformist minister, never mind the denomination or the part of Great Britain, because the call sounded faint there, and his flock was slow to answer. The shepherd showed the way, himself enlisting in the ranks, because he was what he was, and came whence he came. Here and thus I found him in 1918, commanding a battery on the Somme at the age... but that would be a tale out of school. A legion might be made up of the men whose real ages are nobody's business till the war is over. Then they might be formed into a real old guard of honour, and Splendissime Mendax might be their motto. I do not say that the Major would qualify. I have forgotten exactly what I heard upon the point, but I am not going to forget something that reached me later from another source altogether, namely the lips of a sometime N.C.O. of the battery. There was not, he asserted, better discipline in any battery in France, but not a man of us ever heard the Major swear. It was a great friend of mine that I had gone forth to see, a cricketer whose only sin was the century that kept him out of the pavilion, a man without an enemy but the one he turned out to fight at 40. Yet the man I am gladdest to have seen that day on the Somme is not my friend, but my friend's friend and Major. And to think he opened his kindly fire upon me by saying absurd things about the only book of mine which has very many friends, and that I let him, God forgive me, instead of bowing down before that gorgeous man. Chapter 12. The Guards. The Jocks started me thinking in units, the Gunners set me off on the chance meetings of this little war, and between them they have taken me rather far afield from my Noah's Ark in the mud. But I am not going back just yet, though the ground is getting dangerous. I am only too well aware of that. It is presumptuous to praise the living, and I, for one, would rather stab a man in the back than pat him on it. But may I humbly hope that I do neither in these notes? The bristling risks shall not deter me from speaking of marvellous men as I found them, nor yet from expressing, as best I may, the homage they inspired. I can only leave out their names and the names of the places where we met, and trust that my precautions are not themselves taken in vain. But there is no veiling whole units, or at least no avoiding some little rift within the veil. And when the unit is the Guards... But even the Guards were not all in one place last winter. Enough that at one time there were Guardsmen to be seen about the purlieus of that battered caravanserai, which the war found an antique city of sedate distinction, and is like to leave yet another scrap heap. The Guards were in the picture there, if not so much so as the Jocks, for in kilt and bonnet the Jocks on active service are more like Jocks than the Guards are like Guardsmen. Nevertheless, and wherever they wander, the Guards are quite platitudinously unlike any other troops on earth. Memorable was the day they first swarmed into my first hut. Debauched, I dare say, would be the more becoming word. But at any rate they duly marched upon the counter, in close order at that, and, as the correspondents have it, as though they had been on parade. Few of them had anything less than a 5-franc note, all required change. Soon there was not a coin in the till. I wish the patronesses of grand clearance sales could have seen how the Guards behaved that night. Not one of them showed impatience, not one of them was inconsiderate, much less impolite. The sanctity of the queue could not have been more scrupulously observed had our labour boy been there to see to nothing else. He was not there, and I sighed for him when there was time to sigh, for it was easily the hardest night's work I had in France. But the Guards did their best to help us. They were always buying more than they wanted, to make it even money, continually prepared to present the Y.M.C.A. with the change we could not give them. Never was a body of men in better case, calmer, more immaculate, better set up, and more dignified and splendid to behold. They might have walked across from Wellington Barracks. They were actually fresh from what I have heard them call the Cambrai do. There was a bitterly cold night a little later on. It was also later in the night. My young chief was already a breathing pillar of blankets. I was still cowering over a reddish stove, thinking of the hot water bottle which was even then preparing a place for my swaddled feet. From the outer darkness came the peculiar crunch of heavy boots, many pairs of them, rhythmically planting themselves in many inches of frozen snow. I went out and interviewed a Guards corporal with 18 eager, silent file behind him, all off a leave train and shelterless for the night unless we took them in. I pointed out that we had no accommodation except benches and trestle tables and the bare boards of the hut, where the stove had long been black and the clean mugs were freezing to the shelf. "We shall be very satisfied," replied the corporal, "to have a roof over us." I can hear him now, the precise note of his appreciation, candid yet not oppressive, the dignified, unembittered tone of a man too proud to make much of a minor misfortune of war. Yet for fighting men just back from Christmas leave, howsoever it may have come about, what a welcome! I never felt a greater brute than lying warm in my bed within a yard of the stove that still blushed for me, and listening to those silent men taking off their accoutrements with as little noise as possible, preparing for a miserable night without a murmur. Later in the winter it was said that men were coming back from leave disgruntled and depressed. My answer was this story of the corporal and the 18 freezing file. But they were guardsmen, nearly all. Not the least interesting of individual guardsmen was one who, across our counter, nicely and politely, declared himself an anarchist. It was the slack hour towards closing time, before the national anthem at the cinema prepared us for the final influx, and I am glad I happened to be free to have that chat. It was most instructive. My guardsman, who was accompanied by the inevitable Michaelides, was not a temporary soldier. Both were fine seasoned men of 12 or 13 years' service, who had been through all the war with such breaks as their tale of wounds had necessitated. The anarchist did all the talking, beginning, most attractively to me, about cricket. He was a keen watcher of the game, an old habitué of Burton Court, and intense admirer of certain distinguished performers for the Household Brigade. "A great man," was his concise encomium for more than one. How the anarchy came in I have forgotten. It was decked in dark sayings of a rather homely cut concerning the real war to follow present preliminaries. But I thought the real warrior was himself rather in the dark as to what it was all to be about. At any rate, he failed to enlighten me, as perhaps I failed to enlighten him on the common acceptation of the term anarchy. Reassure me he did, however, by several parenthetical observations, which seemed to fall from the inveterate soldier rather than the soi-disant revolutionary. "But of course we shall see this war through first," he kept interrupting himself to impress on me. "Nothing will be done till we have beaten Germany." On balance, I was no wiser about the anarchist point of view, but all the richer for this peep into a guardsman's mind. It was like a good sanitary cubicle, filled with second-hand gimcrackery, but still the same good cubicle, still in essentials exactly like a few thousand more. The meretricious jumble was kept within rigid bounds of discipline and good manners, and not as a temporary measure either, for I was solemnly assured that the real war, when it came, would be a bloodless one. Let us hope other incendiaries will adopt my friend's somewhat difficult ideal of an ordered anarchy. As for his manners, I can only say I have heard views with which I was in full personal agreement made more offensive by a dogmatic advocate than with these monstrous but quite amiable nebulosities. If anarchy is to come, I know which anarchist I want to ride in the whirlwind and direct the storm. He will spare Burton Court, I do believe, and even catch himself saluting with true Guards élan the great men who are still permitted to hit out of it. Tradition in the Guards, you conjecture, means more than machine guns, more than artillery support. It is half the battle they are always pulling out of the fire. It may be other things as well. I heard a delightful story about one battalion, but I heard it from a fellow tradesman whose business it was, or was before the war, to say more than his prayers. The libel, for it is too good to be true, was that one of the senior battalions, having given a dinner in some Flemish town early in the war, did a certain amount of inadvertent damage to municipal property during the subsequent proceedings. One in authority wrote to apologise to the mayor, enclosing the wherewithal for reparation. Whereupon the mayor presented himself in high glee, brandishing an equally handsome apology for the same thing done in the same place by the same regiment in 1711. One royal night I had myself as the guest of a company in another of their battalions. The camp was about half-way between our hut and the front line, near the road and in mud enough to make me feel at home. But whereas we weltered in a town-locked pool, This was in the open sea. Not a tree or a chink of masonry in sight. Just a herd of elephants or Nissen huts, linked up by a network of duckboards like ladders floating in the mud. Mud! It was more like clotted cocoa to a mind debauched by such a tipple. And the great split tubes of huts, like a small armada, turned turtle in the filth. The outer tube, I think, was steel, duly corrugated, but wooden inner tubes made the mess hut, and the one I shared with my host, voluptuously snug and weatherproof. It was the wildest and wettest night of all the winter, but not a drop or a draught came in anywhere, and I'm afraid I thought with selfish satisfaction of the many perforations of our own thin-skinned hut. An open fire was another treat to me, and I remember being much intrigued by a buttery hatch in the background. It reminded me of the third act of the admirable Crichton. There were only 4 of us at dinner, or 5 including a parrot who hopped about saying things I have forgotten. All the other 3 were temporary guardsmen, that I knew, but to me they seemed the lineal descendants of the bare-skinned and whiskered heroes in old volumes of Punch. I suppose they were colder in their balaclava huts, but I warrant the other atmosphere was much the same. We should not have had Wagner on a gramophone before Sebastopol, but they would have given me Veuve Clicquot, or whatever the very best may have been in those days. And if I had committed the solecism of asking for more bread, having consumed my statutory ration, the mess waiter of 1855 would have put me right in the same solicitous undertone that spared my blushes in 1918. The perfect blend of luxury and discipline would have been as captivating then as now and ever, and the kindness of my hosts a thing to write about in fear and trembling, no matter how gratefully. But there would have been no duckboards to follow through wind and rain to my host's warm hut, and I should not be looking back upon as snug a winter's night as one could wish to spend. How we lay talking while the storm frittered its fury upon the elephant's tough hide! Once more it was talk of school days, but not of mine. It was all about Eton this time, and nearly all about a boy there who had been most dear to us both. He was now out here in his grave, but which of them was not? Of the group that I knew best before the war, only he whom I was with tonight. I lay awake listening to his even breathing, and prayed that he at least might survive the Holocaust yet to come. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Notes of a Camp Follower on the Western Front by E.W. Hornung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. Notes of a Camp Follower on the Western Front by E.W. Hornung. Part 4. A Boy's Grave. February 1918. Chapter 13. Somewhere in Flanders there was a ruined estaminet with an early trench running round it that I longed to see for the sake of a grave in the farmyard not far behind. The grave itself was known to be obliterated, though dug very deep by the men who loved the boy they laid there at dead of night, and though the sergeant, who loved him most, could say what a strong cross they had placed over it, the grave was so situated in the whole position so continuously under fire, that official registration was never possible, nor any further reassurance to be had. The boys' division went out of the line, and at length went back into another sector, but more than one officer who knew his people, and one brave friend who had only heard of them, searched the spot without avail. For 2 years it was so near the enemy and so heavily shelled that fear became a mortal certainty that everything had been swept away. Then the boy's father chanced to meet his army commander, and that great human soldier ordered the investigation that bore out every dread. Nothing remained to mark the grave, and yet I longed to see the place. The tide of battle had at last receded. At least I might see what was left of the trench where the boy had fallen, and have something to tell his mother on my return. So I had set my heart, originally, on working for the YMCA in Flanders. Had I been given my way about that, very little that I have now to tell could possibly have happened. It was ordained, however, that I should go to France, and a long way down the line. An impossible journey from my secret goal. To be honest, I had a voice in this myself, and even readily acquiesced in the arrangement, for there were sound reasons for taking the first opening that offered, and, on reflection, I saw myself the unsoundness of my first position. After all, I was not going out for secret or for private ends, and even in Flanders, what means or what authority should I have had for hunting among graves, marked or unmarked? What guide could I have hoped to get to show me all I wished to see, and what could I have seen or done without a guide? Already the new plan spelt a providential exclusion from a sphere of futile mortification and divided desires. To France I went, and with an easy mind. And in France, the first people I saw, in my first hut, as customers across the counter, were the boys' old division. I suppose the odds against that must have been fairly long. Of all the divisions in the BEF, only 3 were plying between our town and the line, and of those 3 that division was one. It was, moreover, the one that we saw most of in the Ark. Theirs were the pink barracks just outside our gates. It was their cinema that lay across our bows in the mud, their motley battalions that could make the hut a Babel of all dialects in Great Britain. The boys' brigade was up the line when I arrived. In a few days it came down, and under the familiar regimental cap badge how eagerly I sought the faces that looked old enough to have 3 years' service. They are the veterans of this war. But few, it seemed, were left. Did I discover one, he had not been in B Company, I grew ashamed of questioning. It was not before the brigade had been up the line for another 16 days and come back again that a little hard-bitten man aroused fresh hopes and passed all tests. He had not only been in the regiment at the time, but in B Company. Not only in B Company, but in the boys' platoon. There when he fell, one of the burial party. We had a long talk in the inner room. It appeared there were 2 other survivors of the old platoon. The sergeant, as I knew to my sorrow, had died company sergeant major at Passchendaele. Of the other 2, one in particular, now a bandsman, but in 1915 a stretcher-bearer, could tell me everything. He should come and see me himself. He never did come, and I saw no more of the little man who promised to send him. Once again they all went up the line, and by the time that tour was over I had deserted the hut near their barracks. The little man called there and left a message. It was to say he was going on leave for 3 weeks, and the battalion were going away to rest. When they all got back, he would bring the bandsman to see me without fail. It is a long story, but then coincidence, or what we will, was stretching a very long arm. Coincidence, at least in the literal sense, was indeed stretching out both arms. One of them was busy all this time at distant Ypres. An unknown friend there, remotely connected with the boy's people, thought he had discovered the boy's grave. He had written home to say so. The news was sent out to me, and we got into correspondence. He had searched the shell-blasted farmyard where the burial was known to have taken place, and he had discovered evidence. Some of this evidence he eventually sent me. A cheap French or Flemish watch, red with the rust and mould of a soldier's grave. Just the watch that a boy would buy at the nearest town for his immediate needs. Now, at the time of his death, this boy's watch was being mended in London. Therefore the one now in my hands was good evidence as far as it went. A bootstrap had been found as well, and something else that tallied terribly. On the strength of all this testimony, and of an instinctive certainty in the mind of our unknown friend, a new cross already marked the site of these discoveries. He wanted me to see the place for myself, and as soon as possible, in case the enemy should make his expected thrust in that quarter. nor could I have gone too soon for my own satisfaction. Grave or no grave, for I could not quite share his sanguine conviction, I longed to grasp the hand of a man who had done so much for people he had never met, and to see all there was to see with my own eyes. But it is not so easy to travel 60 miles up or down the line. It is a question of permits, which take some getting, and of facilities which very properly do not exist. Military railways are not for the transport of civilian camp followers on private business. Moreover, they do go slow where there is no military occasion for much speed, and I had my work when all was said. But my luck, if you like, was in again. The first old friend that I had met in France was a friend in a higher place than I may say. Already he had shown himself my friend indeed, now in my need, but here the coincidences multiply, and must be kept distinct. On the very morning I heard from Ypres, with the watch and the invitation, I was due to visit this old friend in another part altogether. He sent his car for me, the splendid man. I showed him my letter from Ypres. "You will have to go," he said. "But how?" "In my car." 60 miles? It was much more from where he was. "You can have it for 2 days." I could not thank him, nor can I here. How can a man speak for the mother of an only child, whose grave he was to see with her eyes as well as his own, so that one day he might tell her all? Without a car, in fine, the thing was impossible. There are no thanks for actions such as this, none that words do not belittle. A day was fixed, 10 days ahead. This gave me time to write to the boy's mother, and gave her time to send direct to Ypres all the bulbs and plants that she could get, to make her child's bed as gay that spring as he himself had been all the days they were together. And yet, was it his grave that had been found? Was the evidence as good as it seemed? I was going all the way to Ypres on the strength of that local evidence only. If I could have but taken one or other of those 2 men who were there when it happened in 1915. But one of them was away on leave, his 3 weeks not nearly up. The other, the bandsman who knew most of all, might or might not be with the battalion, but the battalion itself was still away. I found that out for certain on the morning of the day before I was to start. They were still resting many kilometres back. I had no means of getting to them, even if I had had the right sort of desire. But the fact was that everything had come about so beautifully without one move of mine that I was quite consciously content to drift in the current of an unfathomable influence. That afternoon there came to my hut, for no particular reason that he ever told me, a man I had not met before. He was the senior chaplain of the boys' division. We made friends, by what steps I cannot remember, but I must have told him where I was going next day. He was interested. I told him the whole thing. He said, "But surely there must be somebody in the battalion you could take with you to identify the place." I told him there was such a man, a bandsman, but the battalion was away resting, and I was not sure but that the man himself was on leave. Said the chaplain, "I can find out. I know where they are. I can get them on the telephone. If you don't hear from me again, go round their way in the morning when you get the car. It's 10 kilometres in the wrong direction, but it may be worth your while." Worth my while. I did not hear from him again, not a word all that anxious evening to spoil the prospect he had opened up. And in the morning came the car, a powerful limousine, mine for the next 2 days. My pass from the APM was for Ypres only, but I did not think of that. In less than an hour we had found those rest billets among ploughed fields at peace in the spring sunshine, and at the right regimental headquarters a young corporal ready waiting in his field overcoat. It was the bandsman, he who had been nearest to the boy at the very last, to whose special care his dear body had been committed, the living man who had most to tell me. And the first thing he told me showed what a mercy it was to have him with me. But at the moment it came as a shock. I had shown him the watch. He had shaken his head. No watch had been buried with the boy. Of that the corporal was unshakably certain. And he was the man to know, the man whose duty it had been to make sure at the time. Away went our strongest piece of evidence. Then I told him about the bootstrap, always a doubtful item in my own mind, and the corporal swept it aside at once. The boy had not worn boots with straps. He had worn ordinary laced boots and puttees. Exactly as I had been thinking at the back of my mind. He had not been out many weeks, and I knew every noble inch of him that went away. So, after all, it was not his grave that had been found. That would have been a grievous blow, but for the transcending thought, it was not his grave that had been disturbed. We might never have known but for this young soldier at my side, who was saying quite confidently that he could show me where the grave really was. One of, at most, 3 living men who could. Who had brought him to my side, at the very last moment? The man I wanted, the one man needful. To be sure, the senior chaplain of their division, but why should the senior chaplain, a man I never knew before, have come to my hut in the nick of time to do me this service, so definitely desired? Why should I myself have come to the very place in France where the division was waiting for me, the one place where I had also an old friend with a car to lend me when the time came? Why had I not gone to Belgium, to be near the boy as I first intended? And why, at the very time, should a complete stranger have been making entirely independent efforts to find the grave in Belgium that I yearned to see? Chance is no answer, unless the word be held to cover an organic tissue of chances, each in turn closely related to some other chance, all component parts of a chance whole. And what sensation novelist would build a plot on such foundations, and hope to have his tale convincing? Not I, at my worst. And there were more of these chances still to come, albeit none that mattered as did those already recounted. Nor is there very much left to tell that bears telling here. In Ypres I did not find my great unknown friend. He had warned me, when it was too late to alter plans, that he might be called home on a private matter, and this had happened. But he had told me I should find his trusty sergeant, who had taken part in the investigations, ready to help me in every way, and so indeed I did. The man was, among other things, an enthusiastic amateur gardener. He had known exactly what to do with the bulbs and plants, which he had unpacked on their arrival and was keeping nice and moist for the next morning. But this was not the first thing we had to talk about. The first thing was to impress upon the sergeant the importance of not letting my witness know that a new cross had been put up, and so to ensure absolutely independent identification of the spot. He gave me his promise, and I know he kept it. Next morning, under a leaden February sky, the 3 of us drove north in the car, accompanied by a second sergeant with digging tools, in case the bandsman located the grave elsewhere and I was bent upon some proof. At the time I did not know why he was with us. Later, the quiet little fact above spoke volumes for the good faith of the party. It was completed by a young Catholic padre from Ypres, so that the only office which the boy had lacked at the hands of his dear men might now be fulfilled. I am following the course we took upon a military map, given to the boy's father by one of the many officers who had befriended him in his trouble, and I had been prepared for the thickening cluster of shell holes further on by more than one aeroplane photograph sent from Army Headquarters. Oh, that all whom this war has robbed of their heart's delight could know, as this father knows, how the huge heart of the army is with them in their sorrow. There was the army commander, who had done what he could for a man he met once by chance. It was not much that even he could do, but how more than readily it had been done. And now, here in the car, itself a tangible sign of infinite compassion, were these NCOs and this young priest, and their grave faces and their kind eyes. One's heart went out to them. It seemed all wrong to be taking men, who any day might be in theirs, to see a soldier's grave in cold blood. So we fell to discussing the sky, the mud, and such landmarks as remained, quite simply and naturally, as the boy himself would have wished. "Plains that the moonlight turns to sea," the boy had quoted in describing the plain we were crossing now. But it had become a broken plain since his time, covered with elephant huts and pill boxes, scored by light railways, the roads on which no man might live in those days themselves alive with traffic in these, with lorries and men and all the abundant activities of a host behind a host. The car stopped 100 or 200 yards from our destination, towards which we threaded our way over duckboards, through and past these mushroom habitations, till we came to the green open space which was all that remained of the farm. Not a stone or a brick to be seen, not even a heap of bricks, or a charred beam, or the empty socket of pillar or post. Only the 2 gate-posts themselves, looking like stumps of trees. But what better than a gateway to give a man his bearings? It led the bandsman straight to a regular file of such stumps which really had been trees, and in his path stood a white cross, new and sturdy, at which I had been looking all the time, at which he stopped without looking twice, still studying the ground and the bits of landmarks that survive. It was the place. It was the boy's grave, and the discoverer's, nay, the diviner's instinct stood vindicated as wonderfully as his evidence had been discredited. Almost adjoining it was a great shell-hole full of water. But it was not our grave that the shell had rifled. Our grave had been dug too deep. It was as though the boy himself had said, "It's my grave all right, but I don't want you to go thinking that those were my things. All that was me or mine is just as they left it." So we took off our helmets and stood listening to the young priest reading the last office, in Latin first, and then in English. And many of the beautiful sentences were punctuated by loud reports, which I took for our guns if I thought of them at all. For as yet I had heard hardly anything else down south. But after the service I saw little black balloons appearing by magic in mid-air, expanding into dingy cloudlets and presently dissolving shred by shred. It was enemy shrapnel all the time. Then the 2 sergeants prepared the ground with gentle skill, and we knelt and put in the narcissus bulbs, the primroses and pinks, the phlox and the saxifrage that the boy's mother had sent him, and a baby rose tree from an old friend who loved him in the corner of England that he loved best. It must be climbing up his cross, if it has lived to climb at all. The clouds had broken before the service ended with the sprinkling of holy water, and now between the shell bursts, while we were yet busy planting, came strains of distant music, as thin and faint and valiant as the February sunshine. It was one of our British bands, perhaps at practice in some safe fold of the famous battlefield, more likely assisting at some ceremonial further away than I imagined, for they seemed to be playing very beautifully, and when they finished with Auld Lang Syne they could not have hung more pathetically upon the closing bars, as if they were playing at our graveside, for the boy who always loved a band. Then there was his trench to see, but it was full of water where it had not fallen in, and was not like a trench any more. And the estaminet at the crossroads, that cruelly warm corner where he had passed into peace, it too had vanished from the earth. But the gentle slope that had been no man's land was much as he must have seen it in anxious summer dawns, and under the stars that twinkled on so many of his breathless adventures in the early bombing days, when he pelted Germans in their own trench with his own hand, and thought it all a jaunt, thought it just like throwing in from cover, declaring it as safe as going up to a man's front door-bell, pulling it, and running off again. Well, this was where he had played those safe games, and true enough it was not by them that he met his death, but standing too down there under shell fire on a summer's morning after his own heart, with eyes like the summer sky turned towards the same line of trees my eyes were beholding now, his last thought for his men. I could almost hear his eager question, "Is everybody all right?" They were the boy's last words. Did I enter into the spirit of all that last chapter of his dear life the better for being on the scene, and watching shrapnel burst over it even as he watched it 1,000 times? I cannot say I did. I doubt if I could have entered into it more than I always had. We were such friends. But how he must be entering into the whole spirit of my whole pilgrimage! It was like so much of his old life and mine. Always he knew that he had only to call, and I would come to him at school or wherever he was. Many a time I had jumped into a car and gone, though he never did call me in his life. Had he now? There was my friend's car waiting, as it might have been once more in the lane opposite the old grey chapel behind the trees. And here were we passengers, a party from the four winds, all brought together by different agencies for the same simple end. Who had brought us? Who had prompted or inspired those directly responsible for our being there? It was not, you perceive, a case of one god from a machine, but of three at the very least. Who had so beautifully arranged the whole difficult thing? Even to the band. But for Auld Lang Syne, one might not take it seriously for a moment. But remembering those searching strains, and the pathos put into them, the early hour, the wild place, the bursting shrapnel, who can help the flash of fancy? Not one who will never forget the boy's gay, winning knack of getting the bands to play what he wanted. This was just the tune he would have called, that we might all join hands and not forget him, yet remember cheerily for his sake. But it all had been as he would have had it, if he could. Not one little thing like that, but the whole big thing he must have wanted, all granted to him or his, without their mortal volition at any stage. Chances or accidents by the chapter, if you will. No man on earth can prove the contrary, and yet there are few, perhaps, who have lost their all in this war, who would not thank God for such a string of happenings. But one does not thank God for a chain of chances, and if any link was of his forging, why not the whole chain, as two thankful people dare to think. End of chapter 13. Chapters 14 and 15 of Notes of a Camp Follower on the Western Front by E. W. Hornung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. Notes of a Camp Follower on the Western Front by E. W. Hornung. Part 5. The Rest Hut. February to March 1918. Chapter 14. Fresh Ground. It was not my inspiration to run one of our huts entirely as a library for the troops. I was merely the fortunate person chosen to conduct the experiment. In most of the huts there was already some small supply of books for circulation, and at our headquarters in the town a dusty congestion of several hundred volumes which nobody had found time to take in hand. The idea was to concentrate these scattered units, to obtain standard reinforcements from London and the base, indent for all the popular papers and magazines, and go into action as a free library at the front. It was at first proposed to do without any kind of canteen, but I was all against driving a keen reader elsewhere for his tea, and held out for light refreshments after 4, and cigarettes all the time. On this and many other points I was given my way in a fashion that would have fired anybody to make the venture a success. The hut placed at my disposal was a very good one in the middle of the town, indeed within the palisade of the once magnificent town hall. That grandiose pile had been knocked into mountains of rubbish, with a mere stump of its dizzy belfry still towering over all as the Matterhorn of the range. These ruins formed one side of a square like a mouthful of bad teeth, all hollow stumps or clean extractions. Our upstart hut was the only whole building of any sort within sight. It had a better saloon than my last landship. On the other hand, it was infested with rats from the surrounding wrecks. They would lope across the floor under one's nose, or dangle their tails from beams overhead, and I slept with a big stick handy. Relays of peacetime carpenters, borrowed from their units for a day or two each, fell upon all the benches and tabletops they required, and turned them into 5 long tiers of bookshelves behind the counter. In the meantime, our own special artist was busy on a new and noble scheme of decoration, and 2 or 3 of us up to our midriffs in the first 1,000 books. They were a motley herd, the sweepings of unknown benefactors' libraries, the leavings of officers and men, cunning shafts from the devout of all denominations, and the first draft of cheap masterpieces from the base. Classification was beyond me, even if time had been no object. How could one classify the Soul of Germany, a Yorksteimer Alroad, the Livin's Ways, From Workhouse to Westminster, Life Story of Withgooks MP, 4 copies, or even the books these titles stood for in the typewritten catalogue that arrived from Paris too late to entertain us? All authors in alphabetical order seemed the simplest principle, and in practice even that arrangement ran away with days. Then each volume had to be labelled over the publisher's imprint on the binding, and the labels filled in with the letter and number of each in one's least illegible hand, and this took more days, though the rough draft of the catalogue emerged simultaneously. And the merit of the plan, if any, was that the catalogue order eventually coincided with that of the actual books on the shelves. The drawback was that books kept dropping in or turning up too late for insertion in their proper place. I could think of no better way out of this difficulty than by resorting to a large Z class, or dump for latecomers. This met the case, though far from satisfying my instincts for the rigour of a game. Another time, this coming winter for instance, when I hope to have it all to do again, I shall be delighted to adopt some more approved method of dealing with a growing library. Last spring one had to do the best one could by the light of nature. Nevertheless, there was not much amiss, except the handwriting, with the clean copy, in carbon duplicate, of a catalogue which ran to a good many thousand words, and kept 2 of us out of bed till several successive midnights. For by this time I had a staunch confederate, who took the whole thing as seriously as I did, and perhaps even found it as good fun. We had hoped to open, it was really very like producing a play, early in February, but a variety of vicissitudes delayed the event until the 20th of the month. As the day approached, we had many visitors who had heard of our effort and were prepared to spread our fame. Time was well lost in showing them round, and I confess I enjoyed the job. They had to begin by admiring the scraper. It was perhaps the worst scraper in Europe. I ached for a week from sinking its 2 uprights into harder chalk with a heavier pickaxe than I thought existed, but it was symbolical. It meant that you could leave the mud of war outside our hut. But I'm afraid the first thing to be seen inside was inconsistent with this symbol. It was the complete Daily Mail sketch map of the Western Front, the different sheets joined together and mounted on to the locked door opposite the one in use. The feature of this feature was that the line was pegged out from top to bottom with the best red tape procurable in the town. It toned delightfully with the art green of the sketch map. In the ordinary YMCA nobody would have seen it. In winter, at any rate, it is dusk at high noon in the ordinary hut, which is lighted only by canvas windows under the eaves. In our hut, however, we had a pair of fine skylights, expressly cut to save our readers' eyes, glazed with some shimmering white stuff, which seemed to increase the light like a fall of snow, instead of slightly diluting it like the best of glass. The side windows glistened with the same material, so that a dull day seemed to clear up as you entered. Between the skylights stood 4 trestle tables under one covering of American cloth, whereon the day's papers, magazines, and weeklies were to be displayed club fashion. The writing tables, likewise in American cloth, were arranged under the side windows. and at an even distance from either end of the fourfold reading table were the 2 stoves. One stove is the ordinary hut allowance. Round each stove ran a ring of canvas and wicker armchairs, in which a tired man might read himself to sleep, and between the chairs stood little round tables for his tea and biscuits when he woke. They were garden tables painted for the part, with spidery black legs and bright vermilion tops, and on each a nice new ashtray, of the least possible intrinsic value, I admit, in further imitation of the club smoking room. That was the atmosphere I wanted for the body of the hut. At the platform end we were ready for anything, from itinerant lecturers to the most local preacher, and from hymns to comic songs. The best piano in the area was equal to any strain, and a somewhat portentous rostrum, though not knocked together for me, was just my height, while the American cloth in which we found it was a dead match for our extensive importations of that fabric. It was at this end of the hut that our special artist and decorator had excelled himself. All down the sides were his frieze of flags, his dado of red and white cotton in alternate stripes, and his own extraordinarily effective chalk drawings on sheets of brown paper between the windows. But for the angle under the roof over the platform he had reserved his masterpiece. One day, while we were still busy with the books, our handyman of genius had stood for an hour or two on a ladder, and descending left behind him a complete allegorical cartoon of literature, including many life-size figures in flowing robes, busy with the primitive tools of one's trade. I am not an art critic, like my friend the war correspondent, who ruthlessly detected faults in drawing instead of applauding all that we had to show him. To me, the pride of our walls was at least a remarkable tour de force. The official photographer was to have come at a later date to witness if I exaggerate. He left it too long. He may have another chance this winter. Literature has been preserved. These private views too often started at the counter, because visitors had a way of entering through my room. But to see the library, as I do think it deserved seeing, one had to turn one's back upon all I have described, and with a proper piety bear down upon the books. In their 5 long shelves, each edged and backed with the warm red cotton of the dado, and broken only by my door behind the counter, those 30 yards of good and bad reading were wholly good to see, on our opening day especially, before the first borrower had made the first gap in their serried ranks. There indeed stood they at attention, their labels at the same unwavering height as so many pairs of puttees, except the few I had not affixed myself, and I felt that I, too, had turned a mob into an army. Immediately over the top row, on a scroll expertly lettered by our special illuminator, another of our talented band, its new motto from Thomas à Kempis ran right across the hut: "Without labour there is no rest, nor without fighting can the victory be won." I really think I was as pleased with that on the morning I thought of it in bed, having just decided to call the hut the Rest Hut, as Thackeray is said to have been when he danced round his bedroom crying, "Vanity Fair! Vanity Fair! Vanity Fair!" But I only once heard a remark upon our motto from the men. "Well, that's logic anyhow," said one when he had read it out across the counter. I could have wished for no better comment from a soldier. Higher still, in the angle of the roof at this end, the flags of the Allies enfolded the sign of the Rest Hut, which was an adaptation of the red triangle. I was having a slightly more elaborate version compressed into a rubber stamp for all literary matter connected with the hut. The rubber stamp did not arrive in time for the opening, nor had there been time to stick our few rules into more than a few of the books, but I had a paste pot and a pile of these labels ready on the counter. And since we are going into details, one may as well swing for the whole sheep. The Rest Hut Library, Y.M.C.A. This book may be taken out on a deposit of 1 franc, which will be returned when the book is brought back. Books cannot be exchanged more than once daily, and no reader is entitled to more than 1 volume at a time. A book may be kept as long as required, but in each other's interests readers are begged to return all books as soon as they conveniently can, and in as good order as possible. Frankly, we've flattered ourselves on dispensing with the time limit and fine, and in practice I can commend that revolutionary plan to other amateur librarians. Obviously you are much less likely to get a book back at all if you want money with it. You shall hear in what circumstances many of ours were to come back, and at what touching trouble to men of whom one can hardly bear to think to-day. But all the books were not for circulation. A poetry and reference shelf bestrode my end of the counter. Duplicate poets were to be allowed out like novels, but they were not expected to have many followers. A more outstanding feature, perhaps the apple of the librarian's glasses, was the new book table, just in front of the counter at the same end. I thought a table full of really new books would be tremendously attractive to the real readers, that their mere appearance might convey a certain element of morale. So one long day I had spent upon 15 begging letters to 15 different publishers. Not the same begging letter either, for some of them I knew, and some of them knew me not wisely but too well. On the whole, the 15 played up, and the new book table was well and truly spread for the inaugural feast. The novelties were to grace it for a fortnight before going into the catalogue, and we started with quite a brave display. There were travels and biographies, new novels and books of verse, all spick and span in their presentation wrappers, and we arranged them most artistically on a gaudy tablecloth that cost 30 francs, with a large cardboard mug, by our illuminator, warning other mugs off the course. And I think that really is the last of our preparations, unless I mention the receptacles for waste paper, which proved quite unable to compete against the floor. They were, I dare say, the most fatuously faddy and elaborate preparations ever made for a library which might be blown sky high at any moment by a shell. I had not forgotten that none too remote contingency, but it was the last thing I wanted any man to remember from the moment he crossed our threshold. We were just about 5 miles from the Germans, and I had gone to work exactly as I should in the peaceful heart of England. But that was just where I wanted a man to think himself, until he stepped back into the war. Chapter 15. Opening Day. It really was rather like a first night, but there was this intimidating difference, that whereas the worst play in the world draws at least one good house, we were by no means certain of that measure of success. Our venture had been announced, most kindly, in divisional orders, as well as verbally at the YM cinema, but still we knew it was not everybody who believed in us, and that a washout had been predicted with some confidence. Even those in authority who had most handsomely given me my head, were some of them inclined to shake theirs over the result. It was therefore an exciting moment when we opened at 2 o'clock on the appointed afternoon. There was more occasion for excitement when I had to lock the door for the last time some weeks later, and the two disappointments are not to be compared. But my private cup has seldom filled more suddenly than when I unlocked it with my own hand, and beheld not one solitary man in sight. A washout was not the word, it was my Niagara. At least it looked like it. But after one bad quarter of an hour it turned into a steady trickle of repentant warriors. If the two of us had been holding a redoubt against the enemy, I am not sure that we should have been more delighted to see them than we were. In half an hour the big reading table was surrounded by solemn faces. Each of the 2 stoves had its full circle in the easy chairs. The new book table had been discovered, was being thronged, and the best piano in the area yielding real music to the touch of a real pianist. The rest hut had started on its short but happy voyage. Those there were who came demanding candles and boot polish, and who fled before our softest answers. And there were seekers after billiards, who had to be directed elsewhere for their game. I had tipped too many cues in the last hut, and stopped too many games for the further performance of that worse than thankless task, to have the essential quality of the rest hut subverted by a billiard table. The readers, writers, musicians, and above all the weary men of an army corps were the fish for my rod, and we had not been open an hour before I was enjoying good sport, tempered by early misgivings about my flies. The first book that I connect with a specific inquiry was one that I had certainly failed to order. It was Anything of Walter de la Mare's, and I felt a Philistine for having nothing, but a fool for supposing for a moment that I had pitched my hut within the bounds of Philistia. There might have been a conspiracy to undeceive me on the point without delay. The poetry shelf, despite deficiencies so promptly proven, received attention from the start. I forget if it was Mr. de la Mare's admirer who presently took out the Golden Treasury, of which we mercifully had several copies. It was certainly a jock. I showed him the shelf, and could have wrung his hand for the tone in which he murmured "Keats." It was reverential, awe-stricken, and just right. Clearly his Dominie had not abused the tawse. In the meantime I had taken a deposit on 3 prose volumes. These were they, these the first 3 authors to cross my counter. 1. George Meredith, The Ordeal of Richard Feverel. 2. Robert Louis Stevenson, Across the Plains. 3. Hilaire Belloc, Mr. Clutterbuck's Election. As I say, it seemed like a conspiracy, but I swear I was not one of the conspirators. They were, my benefactor already, the pianist and his friends. 3 young privates in the R.A.M.C., all afterwards great friends of mine. Of course, this form was too good to be true of the mass, and the particular field ambulance to which they belonged was an unusually brainy unit, as I came to know it through many other representatives. But I shall always be grateful to that musical young Meredithian for the start he gave me, and may this mite of acknowledgment meet his spectacles. On the same opening page of my first day book, to be sure, a less rarefied level is reached by some comparatively pedestrian stuff, including a work of Mr. Charles Garvice, and no fewer than 2 wastrels of my own composure, as the village organist had it. But my place, though gratifying, was obviously due to an ulterior curiosity, and among the 23 books in all that went out that afternoon there was a further burst of 4 that went far to restore the higher standard. They were Lorna Doone, my novel, Nicholas Nickleby, and Oliver Twist. The 2 first fell to jocks. The Blackmore masterpiece was read forthwith from cover to cover in the trenches, and that jock came down by special permission for something else as good. A happy afternoon, and of still happier omen. But I was going to need more good stuff. That was the first hard fact to be faced. I had not reckoned with those eager intellectuals, the young stretcher-bearers, who had borne a lantern for the nonce. They were going to bring their friends, and did, and were I to tabulate the books these youths took out between them in the busy months to come, it would be pronounced, I think, as good a little library as a modern young man, with a sociological bias and a considered outlook, could wish to form. And then there were all the books we hadn't got for them. But these missing friends did more, perhaps, to make friends for the rest hut than such as were close to the subject, for one might be able to suggest something else instead, and the man might have read that already, but his face might lighten at the recollection, and across the counter on our 4 elbows the pair of us forged that absent book into the first link of friendship. But anyone can gossip about the books he loves, and with a soldier at the front any fool can talk on any subject. So I had it both ways, as one seldom does, according to the saying. It may be that the men who found their pleasure in the rest hut were by nature responsive and enthusiastic, and not merely sensitized and refined by the generous fires of constant camaraderie and unselfish suffering. I am speaking of them now only as I found them across that narrow counter, while I deliberately pasted my label of rules inside the cover, and deliberately dabbed my rubber stamp down on the fly-leaf opposite. I have seen clean into a noble heart between these delaying rites and a meticulous entry into my day book. It was pain to me when 3 or 4 were waiting their turn, and a certain dispatch became imperative. It always meant a corresponding period without any work or any friend-making across the counter. At the short end, beyond the flap, never lowered in the rest hut, my friend and mate dispensed the cigarettes and biscuits and tea made with devoted care by a wrinkled Frenchwoman worth all the Y.M.C.A. orderlies I ever saw, not excepting the 2 stalwarts at the Ark. The rest hut orderly was a smart soldier of the old type, a clever carpenter, and a good cook with large ideas about breakfast. He lived out, did not give us his whole time, and early struck me as a man of mystery, but he was a quick and willing worker who did his part by us. The jewel of the hut's company was my mate. I can only describe him as an Australian jock, of the first water on both sides. Twice or thrice rejected in Australia, he had come to try again and yet again with no better luck. So here he was, with his fine heart and his dry cough, as near the firing line as he could get for the duration. I may lose a friend for having said so much, yet I have to add that he had taken the whole burden of the till and its attendant accounts, a hut leader's business, off the shoulders of inexperience. Friends who predicted the worst of me in this connection, and are surprised to still see me outside a defaulter's cell, will please accept the only explanation. It was a musical tea that opening afternoon, for another of our talented troupe brought the pick of his orchestra from the Association Cinema in the main street hard by. And for an hour it was like the Carlton, with a difference. I wonder what the Carlton would charge for that difference, even at this stage of the war. Altogether, I thought myself the luckiest civilian alive that February afternoon, but my bed of roses had its crumpled leaf. On the fine great cardboard programme for the week, next the map, our illuminator again, with its cunning slots for movable amusements, besides that of the cinema orchestra, there was something about prayers. That was where I was coming in, on the wrong side of the counter, and as the night advanced it blew a gale inside me. 5 minutes before the time I mounted the platform and made known the worst, and ever afterwards finished the evening by pursuing the same plan, so that all who wished could withdraw, losing only the last 5 minutes, and no man, I promised them, have anything unpalatable thrust down his throat. I am not sure that it was the most courageous method of procedure, but it was mine, and the men knew where they were. I used to read a few verses, a volume of prayer, and but 1 or 2 more. Some men went out, but there was the satisfaction of feeling that those who stayed were in the mood for prayers. After the first week or 10 days, a third worker came to help us, and he being a minister, I persuaded him to relieve me of this nightly duty, though with a sigh that was not all relief. I always loved reading to the men, but prayers are shy work for an old layman, and soldiers, if I know them, care less for the deathless composition of a saint than for the unpremeditated outpouring of the man before their eyes. The minister used to give them all that, perched on a chair in their midst, and he kept a much fuller hut than I at my rostrum of American cloth. End of chapter 15. Chapters 16 and 17 of Notes of a Camp Follower on the Western Front by E. W. Hornung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. Notes of a Camp Follower on the Western Front by E. W. Hornung. Chapter 16. The Hut in Being. I had thought of finishing my account of our opening day with the impressions of a corporal in the A.S.C., as recorded in his diary that very night. But though the extract reached me in a most delightful way, and though decency would have disqualified the flattering estimate of the superintendent as a man of cheery temperament, on examination none of it quite fits in. As description it covers, though with the fleeter pen of youth, ground on which I have already loitered. Enough that it was all a big surprise to him, a home from home already to one soldier of a literary turn, and likely in his opinion to prove a joy to some of the lonely hearts of the lads in khaki. Q.E.F. And though it was weeks and months before the corporal's testimony came to hand, it felt from the beginning as though we really had done it. I say it felt, because there was something in those few thousand cubic feet of air that one could neither see nor hear, something atmospheric, and yet far transcending any atmosphere, whether of the smoking room or library or what not, that we had thought to create. For it was something the men had brought with them, nothing that we had ready. Just as they say on the stage that it is the audience who do half the acting, so it was the soldiers who fought half our little battle, and the winning half. Each of those first days the hut seemed fuller than the day before. More men came early and stayed late. More were to be counted napping round the stoves, as in my rosiest visions, at the same time. More and more books were taken out, and better books, because it was the better educated men who came flocking in, the intellectual pick of an army corps who made our hut their club. If ever a dream came true, if ever a reality excelled an ideal, it was in the wonderful success of our little effort. Little enough, in all conscience, our bubble in the tide of travail, but it is only in little that these delightful flukes come off, and the bubble was soon enough to burst. In the meantime there were elements of imperfection even in our rest hut, one or two things on both sides of the counter to pique a passion for the impeccable. To begin with, the books. We really had not enough good stuff. Not nearly. Nor am I thinking only, nor yet chiefly, of good stuff in the shape of narrative fiction. It is true that we had not Merediths enough, nor a supply of Wessex novels in any way equal to the demand among my Red Cross friends, who read infernally fast, and others of the elect. Nor did the 2 complete Kipling sets, ordered long before the library was opened, ever look like coming. These authors we had only in odd volumes, and few were the nights they spent upon their shelves. But a novel reader is a novel reader. One can generally find him something. My difficulty was in coping with another type altogether, the real bookworm who was far more particular about his food. Anything but novels for this gentleman, as I knew him at the front, and he was often the last person one would have suspected of his particular tastes, sometimes a very young gentleman indeed. There was one such, a rugged lad with a strong Lancashire or Yorkshire accent, whom I thought I should never suit. Lamb, Emerson, Ruskin, and Carlyle he demanded in turn as glibly as Woodbines or Goldflake. But either I had them not, or they were out. Macaulay's essays happened to be in. "The literary ones," said the boy suspiciously to my suggestion. "I don't want the political." I remember he took a golden treasury in the end. As already noted, I had several copies, and needed every one. Then I found that I required a better selection of technical works of all sorts. Engineers, especially, wanted engineering books and journals. It is a rest to the fighting man to pursue his peacetime interests or studies at the front. Nothing, one can well imagine, takes him out of khaki quicker. And that is what his books are for, nor will he shut them a worse soldier. Of devotional works, as I may have hinted, we opened with a fair number. This was increased later by a strong consignment from Tottenham Court Road. But it was impossible to be too strong on that side, with a division of jocks in the sector. "That's the only subject that interests me," said a tight-lipped Scottish rifleman quite simply on the 3rd day. He was not a man I would have surrendered to with much confidence on a dark night, but he had brought back a book called The Fact of Christ, and he wanted something else in the same category. Just then there was nothing, but with imbecile temerity I did say we had a number of religious novels by a lady of great eminence. "I'm no believer in her," was his only reply. I can still see his grim ghost of a smile. Him'll help the Hun who sees it first. The young man vanished for his 16 days, and in his absence came the bale of theology from Tottenham Court Road. "Now I've got something for you," said I, when I saw his keen face again, and lifted off its shelf Dr. Norman MacLeod's most weighty tome. I cannot check the Parisian typist who rendered the title Carré nan Gadel. The subject, however, was the only one that interested the Scottish rifleman, and I took the tongue for his very own. My mistake. "But that'll be in Gaelic," said he, without opening the book. "I've never studied Gaelic, though a Highlander born. Now, had it been in Hebrew," and he really smiled, "might have managed." I saw he might, for obviously he had been a theological student when he felt it incumbent upon him, especially as such, to play a Jock's part in the Holy War. I saw, too, that his smile was shy and gentle in its depths, only grim on top. I think, after all, he would have given his last cigarette to a prisoner of anything like his own manhood. But there was one worse failure than any deficiency on our shelves, and that, alas, was my own poor dear new book table. I had not looked after it as I ought, and neither had my friend and fellow worker. In my eagerness to keep our respective departments ideally distinct, this fancy one had fallen between two stools. Several of the new books were missing before we actually missed one. Then we took nightly stock, and with mortifying results. At last it could go on no longer, and the new books were replaced by old bound volumes of magazines, more difficult to deport. But I was determined to have it out with the hut, and I chose the next Sunday evening service, in the course of which I made it a rule to have my say about things in general, for the delicate duty. I didn't a bit like doing it, as I held my regular readers above suspicion, and they formed the bulk of the little congregation. And that night I was in any case more nervous than I meant them to see, as for once I had decided to tackle the sermon myself. It was the first evening of summer time. Lamplight was unnecessary, and the splendid men sitting at ease in the armchairs, which they had drawn up to the platform end, or at the tables or at the floor, made a great picture in a soft warm dusk. One candle glimmered at the piano, and one on that egregious rostrum as I stood up behind it and trembled in my boots. I told them the new book table had ceased to exist as such, that I had prostrated myself before 15 of my natural enemies in order to spread that table to their liking, but that there had been so many desertions from my crack corps that we were obliged to disband it. Not quite so pat as all that, but in some such words, and to my profound relief I managed to get a laugh, which enabled me to say I thought it hard luck on the 99 just persons that the 100th man should borrow books without going through the preliminary formalities. But I added that if they came across any of the deserters, and would induce them to return to their unit, I should be greatly obliged. They were jolly enough to clap before I launched into my discourse, and it was what their rum ration must have been to them. I wish as much could be done for poor deacons before going over their top. But the point is that at least one deserter did return next day, and what touched me more, the little gifts of books which they had taken to bringing me for the library increased and multiplied from that night. Nor must I forget the humorist, not one of my highbrows, who buttonholed me on my way back to the counter. "Beg your pardon, Mr. Hornung, but that pinch in them new books wasn't a Raffles trick, was it?" But if we failed where I had thought we were doing something extra clever, we met with great success in a less deliberate innovation for which I can claim but little credit. In our quiet hut there was no need for the usual quiet room, but there it was at the platform end, as much use as in the heart of the great Sahara. I had thought of turning it into a little informal sort of lecture room for readings and other entertainments which might not be to everybody's taste. But I had no time to organise or run a sideshow. Neither of us had a spare moment in the beginning. Though we never opened in the morning, except to officers who cared to come in as friends, there was plenty to do behind the scenes. Parcels of new books to unpack and acknowledge, supplementary catalogues to prepare, all manner of preparations and improvements that took the two of us all our time. Then my second mate, the minister, fell from heaven, for he was just our man. He had made a hobby of the literary evening in his border parish, and had come out armed with a number of vivacious appreciations of his favourite authors, the very thing for our quiet room. I handed it over to him forthwith, and we embarked together upon a series of quiet room evenings, which I do believe were a joy to all concerned. At any rate, we always had an audience of 40 or 50 enthusiasts, who took part in the closing discussion, and in time might have been encouraged to put up a better lecture than either of us. The minister, however, was very good, and what he had cut out in his unselfish pursuit of brevity I could sometimes put into a more ponderous performance at the end. It was a greater chance than any one got on a Sunday evening, for though I promised them there was never any previous idea of improving the occasion, yet it was impossible to sit, pipe in mouth, chatting about some great writer to that roomful of thinking, fighting men, and not to touch upon great issues unawares. Life and death, wine and women, I almost shudder to think what subjects were upon us before we knew where we were. But a great big heavenly heart beat back at me, the composite heart of 50 noblemen on easy terms with death, and if they heard anything worth remembering, it came from themselves as much as though they had written the things down and handed them up to me to read out. I have known an audience of young schoolboys as kindly responsive to a man who loved them, but here were grown soldiers on the battle's brink, and their high company and their dear attention, what a pride and privilege were they! If only it had been earlier in the season, not the very hush before the hurricane. There were so many lives and works that we were going to thresh out together. Francis Thompson's, for one. He had crept into our evening with Edgar Allan Poe. I had promised them a long evening with Francis. The stretcher-bearers especially were looking forward to it as much as I was. But I had to send for the books, and they were not in time. And on the last of these quiet room evenings, a young lad in a line regiment had stayed behind and said, "May we have a lecture on Sir John Ruskin, sir?" I said, of course they might, but I was not competent to deliver it myself. His books were on the way, however, for there had been more than one inquiry for them. They also arrived too late. I had never seen the boy before, nor did I again. I may this winter. He shall have his lecture on Sir John Ruskin if I have to get it up myself. Chapter 17. Writers and Readers. For my own ends I kept a kind of librarian's ledger, in which was entered, under the author's name, every book that ever went out, together with its successive dates of departure and return. This amateurish scheme may not have been worth the labour it entailed, in spare moments at the counter or last thing at night, after a turnover of perhaps 100 volumes, many of which needed new labels before returning to their shelf. But I was never sorry I had let myself in for it. Theoretically, one had only to look up a book in this ledger to tell whether it was in or out. But in practice my reward was not then, but is now, when I can see at a glance who really were our popular authors, and which books of theirs were never without a partner, and which proved wallflowers. Statistics, however, are notoriously bad witnesses, and some of mine would not stand cross-examination. Thus, taking for all in all, the author of the first 100,000 may add the blue ribbon of the Rest Hut to his collection. But then we had practically all his books, and some of them 4 or 5 deep. Nor was the one that had more outings than anything of anybody's on our shelves, on that account, the most popular. It may even have been the author's nearest approach to a bad penny. On the other hand, our 4 copies of the first 100,000 were out almost as long as we were open, and all 4 failed to return. As for its sequel, our only copy eloped with its first partner. Had all our authors been Ian Hayes, there would have been no carrying on the library after the first 100,000 seconds. The run on these 2 books was the more noteworthy in view of the fighting reader's distaste for shop. It was the flattering exception to a very human rule, for I find, taking a good many days at random, that while all but 13 of every 100 issues were novels, less than 3 of the 13 were books about the war. Some 49 readers out of 50 wanted something that would take them out of their khaki, and nearly 9 of 10 pinned their faith to fiction. How many preferred a really good novel is another and a more invidious matter, but nothing was more refreshing than the way the old masters held their own. Dickens was in constant demand, especially among the older men, and they really read him, judging by the days the Immortal works stayed out. Again, it was worth noting that here in France A Tale of Two Cities had twice as many readers as Pickwick, which came next in order of popularity. Thackeray was not fully represented, but we had all his best, and they were always out. Of the Brontes we had next to nothing. Of Reade and Trollope far too little. But It Is Never Too Late to Mend enchanted a sapper, a machine gunner, and a Red Cross man in turn, while Orley Farm would have headed our first day's list had it been there on time. George Eliot was never without readers, but Miss Braddon had more, and The Woman in White only one. After Dickens, however, the most popular Victorian was the First Lord Lytton. I confess it rejoiced my heart to hand out the protagonists of a belittled age at least as freely as their opposite numbers of the present century. But I had my surprises. Scott, Sir Walter, was a firm wallflower for the first fortnight. Probably the jocks knew him off by heart, and of course the same thing may apply to their unnatural neglect of the so-called Coelho school of other days. There was, at any rate, nothing clannish about their reading. It was a jock who took out the unspeakable Scott for its only airing, and more than 3/4 of my Stevensonians were Sassenachs. But one could still conjure with the name of Stevenson, as with many another made in his time. Mr. Kipling's soldiers are adored by legions created in their image. Sir H. Rider Haggard was never on the rest house shelf. Messrs. Holmes and Watson were the most flourishing of old firms, and Gerard the only brigadier taken seriously at my counter. Ruritania, too, got back some of its own trippers from the Five Towns. For though you would have thought there was adventure enough in the air we breathed, there was more realism, and it was against the realism we all reacted. Mr. Bennet, to be sure, did not occupy nearly enough space in our capricious catalogue. Neither, for that matter, did Mr. Weyman, Mr. Galsworthy, Mr. Vatchell, nor yet Miss Mary Corelli or Sir Thomas Hull Caine. The fault was not mine, I can assure them. Mr. H. G. Wells, on the other hand, utilised a better chance by tying with the author of Arsène Lupin, and just beating Mr. Phillips Oppenheim for a place it would be unprofitable to compute. Even they could not live with the pace of Mr. Charles Garvice, who in his turn succumbed to the lady styled the Baroness Horsey by her fondest slaves. To these two, and to Miss Ethel Dell, among others I have or have not presumed to mention, I could wish no greater joy than my job at the counter when their books were coming in and, another by the same author if you've got one, being urgently demanded in their place. The most enthusiastic letter ever written for an autograph could not touch the eager tone, the live eye, the parted lips of those unconscious tributes. It is not the look you see in Moody's as you wait your turn, but I have seen it in small boys chasing pirates with Ballantyne the Brave, and in one old lady who fell in love every Sunday of her dear life with the hero of the Family Herald supplement. It was even better worth seeing in a soldier with just the girl in his ruthless hand, and the one girl in the world trembling on the reverential tongue. The man might have been performing prodigies of dreadful valour up the line, but his soul had been on leave with a lady in marble halls. There were 2 young privates in the A.S.C. who bolted their Garvice at about 2 days to the book, and 2 trim corporals of the Rifle Brigade who made as short work of the other magicians. This type of reader always hunted in couples, sharing the most sympathetic of all their passions, if not the books themselves, which would double the rate of consumption. They were the hard drinkers at my bar, but the hardest of all was a lean young jock who smiled as hungrily as Cassius, and arrived punctually at 6 every evening to change his book. He looked delicate, and was, I think, like other regular attendants, on light duty in the town. In any case, he took his bottle of fiction a day without fail, and once, when it was raining, drained it under my nose and wanted another. I refused to serve him. Unlike the other topers, he was a sardonic critic. One night he banged the counter with a book in my own old line, and the invidious comment, "He can do what you no can." I said I was sure, but inquired the special point of superiority. "He can kill his mon as often as he likes," said Macassius grimly, "and bring him to life again. 50 times he has killed yon mon, 50 times." They were nice to me about my books, but very honest. There was a certain stretcher-bearer, a homely old fellow with a horseshoe moustache and mild brown eyes, not from the highbrow unit, but perhaps a greater reader than any of them, and one of those who eschewed the novel. Scenes of clerical life, on top of Lenotre's Incidents of the French Revolution and our 2 little volumes of Elia, had been his only dissipation until, our friendship ripening, he weighed me with his tranquil eyes and asked for Raffles. I seemed to detect a streak of filial piety in the departure, and gave him as fair warning as I could, but only the book itself could put him off. He returned it without a word to temper his forgiving smile, and took out the Golden Treasury as a restorative. Poetry he loved with all his gentle soul, but when at a later stage he asked if I thought he could learn to write poetry, the wounds of vanity were at least anointed. He used to take down Mr. David Somervell's capital Companion to the Golden Treasury from the poetry shelf, and it was delightful to watch his bent head wagging between text and note, a black-rimmed forefinger creeping down either page, and his back as round as it could possibly have been before the war. He told me he was a Northamptonshire shoemaker by trade, and though you would trust him not to scamp a sole or bump a stretcher, there was nothing to show that the war meant more to him than his last, or life more than a chance of reading, the shadow lengthening in the sunshine that he found in books. Once I said how I envied him all that he had read. Very gently, even for him, he answered that he owed it all to his mother, who had taught him when he was so high, and would be 81 come Tuesday. The man himself was only 40, but he was one of those guileless creatures who make one unconsciously look up to him as elders as well as betters. At the front, where the old are so gloriously young, and the young so pathetically old, nothing is easier to forget than one's own age. Often enough mine was brought home to me with a salutary shock. "When I was up the line," said one of my friends, bubbling over with a compliment, "a chap said to me, 'You know that elderly man who runs the rest hut? He's the author of Raffles.'" Disastrous refinement, and the fellow grinned as though he had not turned what might have been a term of friendship into one of pure opprobrium. Elderly? One would as lief be labelled virtuous or discreet. Another of my poetry lovers did really write it, but not his own. There was too much of a twinkle in his brown eyes. They were twinkling tremendously when I saw them first, fixed upon the poetry shelf, and the tightest upper lip in the hut seemed to be keeping down a cheer. No sooner had we spoken than he was saying he kept his own anthology in his field pocket-book, and could I remember the 3rd verse of "Out of the Night that Covers Me"? Happily I could, and so made friends with a man after my heart of hearts. In the first place, he spoke the adorable accent of my native heath or thereabouts, and the things he said were as good as the way he said them. Sense and sensibility, fun and feeling, candour and reserve, all were there in perfect partnership, and his twinkling eye lit each in turn. Before the war he had been a postal telegraphist, and there wasn't a greater pacifist alive. Now he was an RE signaller attached to the Guards, and as for pacifism, the twinkle sharpened to a glitter, and his upper lip disappeared. Yet another man of 40, he had joined up early, and assigned any credit to his wife, good lass. He was splendid about her and their cheery life together. There was a happy marriage, if you like. Ever a rover, as he said romantically, but with a twinkle, he might be in the post office, but his heart was not. And it seemed the couple were one spirit. Every summer they had taken their holiday tramping the moors, their poets in their packs. When they were tired, they would sit down and read aloud. No wonder the poetry shelf made him twinkle. There were 2 cheery children, shaping as you would expect. Their dad borrowed my If to copy out for the small boy's birthday, as well as in his field anthology. Loyalty to one's own, when so impassioned, is by way of draining the plain man's stock. Perfect home lives are not so common that the ordinary middle-aged ratepayer makes haste to give one up for the wars. But the anthologist had not been wrapped up like the rest of us. His loyalties did not even end at his country. That first afternoon, I remember he told me he'd been a bit of a theosophist. Aren't you one now? No, but I still have a warm corner in my heart for them. I thought that was very finely said of a creed outlived. Give me a warm corner for an old love, be it man, woman, or sect. Daily he dropped in to read and chat, not to take out a book until his turn came for the line. It was just when the German push seemed imminent to many, was indeed widely expected, at a date when my friend would still be in his dangerous post. He knew well what it might mean at any moment, and I think he said the wireless man must be last to budge, with the smile he kept for the things he meant. But for once his eyes were not doing their part. "Well, thank God I've had it," he said of his happy past as we locked hands. "And nothing can take it away from you," I had the nerve to say. For these may be the comforts of one's own heart, but it seems an insolence to offer them to a younger man with a harder grip on life. Happily, we understood each other. And many happy chats had we, he had written on the back of the photograph he left me. He had also written his wife's address. David Copperfield went with him when we parted. I wondered if I should ever see either of them again. Sure enough, on the predicted night came the roll of drum fire, as like thunder as noise can be. But it was our drum fire as it happened, and down came my friend next day to tell me about it. No Man's Land had been boiling like cocoa under our shells. He was full of the setback administered to Jerry, of the fun of underground wireless, and the genius of Charles Dickens. I sent him back with Joseph Vance, and we talked of nothing else at our next meeting. It was our last, but I treasure a letter, telling of the ruined city of our friendship, among other things, and a field card of more recent date, and have every hope that the writer is still lighting up underground danger posts with his wise twinkle, and still adding to his field anthology. Yet another hard reader was a Coldstream Guardsman, a much younger man and one of the handsomest in the hut. He too, if you will believe me, had brown eyes, a thing that could not happen to 3 successive characters in a novel, but of another order altogether. If they had never killed a lady in their time, their molten glow belied them. This young man liked a classic author of full flavour. Tom Jones was probably his favourite novel, but we had it not. De Maupassant would have enchanted him, but not the coarse translations on vile paper, or Rousseau's or Cellini's Open Secrets. As it was, he had to put up with Anatole France and oddments of Swift and Wilde. Nor do I forget his justifiable disgust on discovering too late that our Gulliver was a nursery version. He was a delightful companion across the counter, subtle, understanding, soft-spoken, in himself a romantic figure, yet engagingly vulnerable to romance. "I'm feeling sentimental, Mr. Hornung. I want a love story," he sighed one afternoon. I reminded him that he would also want good stuff, and succeeded in meeting all his needs with Ships That Pass in the Night. Next day we had our quiet room evening with Tom Hood, and that was the time I strayed upon delicate ground by way of The Bridge of Sighs, from poem to subject before I knew where I was. The men took it beautifully, and touched my heart by impulsively applauding the very things I should have feared to say to them upon reflection. As for our Coldstreamer, he came straight up to the counter and took out Jeremy Taylor's Holy Living and Dying. End of chapter 17.